Hi guys, welcome to my channel and to my Back to Beauty No Buy year. This year I am concentrating on using my makeup and not buying any. Today's video is the first update for a collaboration with my girl Angela from Beauty by Angela, and this series is called Pan That Palette Partners. In this series, we decided to pick 4 palettes every month, 1 per week, to pair with our Pan That palette. My Pan That palette is the lovely Jaclyn Hill palette, and this month I decided to go full ABH, or Anastasia Beverly Hills, for anyone who's been living on the moon for a while. So I did have 4 ABH palettes this month, starting with the Modern Renaissance in week 1. The first thing I really loved about this week was that I had a matte cream shade to set down my primer with. Obviously, this is just kind of a preference thing, but since Jaclyn over here doesn't have a matte cream shade or anything for me to set down my primer with, I really enjoyed having tempera in this palette. The other thing I really enjoyed about week 1 was all of the cooler tones in this palette that I was able to pair with the Jaclyn Hill palette. I'll show you here, but Jaclyn here, she doesn't have a ton of cool tones, and the cool tones that she does have are pretty dark. So I loved being able to set up the crease or the look with some cooler tones. And my favorite look from this week was actually the look you would have seen in my Pan That palette update, where we announced this series. It was beautiful, it was soft, it was feminine, and it kind of had a purpley mauvey vibe to it that I really enjoyed. So overall, this was a really great palette to pair with my Pan That palette. In week 2, I used the dreaded Subculture palette. I actually really love this palette, so check out the looks that I created. A lot of people aren't a big fan of the Subculture palette, and yes, she is fickle and she takes a little extra time to work with, but I actually really love this palette, especially the color story. I found some really unique combinations with this palette paired with Jaclyn over here, and I really thought this was a fun week. My favorite look was the one where I had electric all over the lid. Yes, it took some building up, and I will give you a little tip. If you have the same problem with your shimmers or transformer shades in this palette, I will say that a sponge tip applicator works really well. You can either use it to apply the shadow to your lid, or you can use it to kind of rub away the hard pan sealing situation. So I just wanted to put that out there. I purchased these at Ulta. I think I got a pack of 12 for $2, and of course you can use them more than once. So I really enjoyed using this palette in week 2, and I felt like it definitely made Jaclyn more versatile and more fun to work with. Week 3, I worked with the Soft Glam palette, and this is definitely the ABH palette that I have worked with the least prior to this month, where I paired it with Jaclyn. And let's take a look at the looks. This palette just made putting together a look so easy. I love the shimmers in this palette, so it was really, really nice to set up a crease with Jaclyn and then use any of these metallic shades on the lid. My favorite look was definitely the look where I used Sultry and Fairy here together. It was kind of a red gold look that was just very sultry and sexy, if you will. I also found that this was really easy to pair with the shades that I'm focusing on in the Jaclyn Hill palette this month. I'm using In Light, Meeks, Silk Cream, and Chip to focus on this month, and this palette with the shimmers and just the, kind of some of the warmer matte shades made it really fun to pair with the shades that I'm working on. Week 4 is the Prism palette. Check out the looks that I created. Week 4 with the Prism palette was definitely the most difficult week for me. I love this color story and it doesn't confuse me or anything like that. But as I was going through the weeks with my palette partners, I was trying to take the majority of the shades for each look from my Pan That palette versus the palette that I partnered it with. And so I don't know, I just didn't find myself feeling inspired by the shimmers in this palette to go with the matte shades in the Jaclyn Hill palette, or vice versa. I didn't find the mattes in here. I mean, here's the thing. Some shades, like this shade Eden, is very similar to the shade Roxy in the Subculture palette, so I didn't really want to use this shade again. And you know, this gold shimmer and whatnot, I just didn't feel inspired by them. I gotta say that my least favorite look was the second look that I created with this shade Osiris and this shade Dimension. I was really wanting to do this blue look, but this shade Osiris has definitely sealed over, as well as it's kind of a funky shade I've figured out. I don't think I've used it a lot in the past because it was so dark that it definitely intimidated me at the beginning of my journey in beauty when I purchased this. But now I just kind of find this very chunky. It's mostly a black base with some blue chunky shimmer mixed in. And so I kind of had to go back into the look and fix it with a matte from the Jaclyn Hill palette, because this did not have the effect that I desired in the outer corner, outer V, whatever you want to call it. So that was not my favorite look, but my favorite look with this palette is actually the one that I'm wearing today. I used two mattes out of this palette, this shade called Saturn right here and this shade called Lure. And I'm always drawn to these sort of dusty, mauvey, rosy shades, and there are quite a few within these 4 palettes. So I do really like how this look turned out today. I set up the crease with the mattes from the Prism palette, and then I went in with some shimmers from Jaclyn. So I have 2 questions that I plan to answer every month in this series, and the first question is, which was my favorite palette and which was my least favorite palette? I've kind of already answered those questions, but my favorite palette of the month was the Soft Glam palette. Again, the shimmers in this palette just made it really easy to create a look that made me feel beautiful and soft and feminine, and that's what I love about this palette. And then, like I said, the Prism palette was my least favorite palette of the month, which was sort of unexpected for me because I was actually looking most forward to using the Prism palette this month. So I do think I will put this puppy back in rotation at some point. I do want to get more use out of it, and I'm hoping that later on I will feel inspired, or maybe I will pull it in on the, you know, odd day where I'm not using my Pan That palette and see if I can't get inspired just with using this palette. And then the other question that I want to answer each month is, do I think that the palette partners, specifically the ones I used this month, either helped or hurt my Pan That Palette progress? And this month, I have to say, I really think it helped. These palettes, specifically these 3 palettes, paired really well, like I said, with the shades that I'm working on in the Jaclyn Hill palette. I found myself being able to reach for my transition shade and my crease shade that I'm working on from the Jaclyn Hill palette very easily with these palettes to create a look. These palettes did not in any way hinder my progress. I felt really good about the fact that most days, most of the shades that I used were from my Pan That palette. So I know some people might think that pairing a palette with my Pan That palette every week might hinder my progress because I am using shades that are not in my Pan That palette. But I think overall it's been a really great experience and journey so far. I love the Jaclyn Hill palette and I'm continuing to feel inspired by it, but I think also with panning a palette and with being really driven to pan this palette that I love this year, I think that pairing a palette with my Pan That palette each week has been really motivating. And with working with my Pan That palette so much, the problem is that all the other palettes that I own are just languishing in my collection. And I want to succeed at Pan That palette, but I also want to use what I have because that's what my Back to Beauty No Buy Year is all about. So I feel like this project has been really successful so far, and I don't think that it hurt my progress whatsoever this month. One little business mention, I do think originally we talked about doing 4 looks a week, and of course it's really up to Angela and I individually how many looks we do, but I do think 4 a week is a little much, so I'm going to shoot for 3 looks a week with my Pan That palette partner because I need to be using my Pan That palette by itself at times, as well as I'm a YouTuber, I have other videos that I need to film for and use different palettes for, just to keep my content fresh and interesting in case you don't care about panning a palette. So make sure you tune in on the 1st when Angela and I will both be updating our Pan That palette projects, because we will be telling you in that video what our 4 new palettes are for the month of March. And on that note, make sure you go check out Angela's video. She had some really fantastic looks this month because I got to see them all behind the scenes. And I hope all of your makeup days are absolutely beautiful makeup days. And I will see you in my next video soon.